At our Preaching Jesus with Interfaith Sensitivity event, which is today on the topic of the Passion and the Passover. And as we start, I just want to say, we're gathering here in safety and in troubling times, and we want to remember the people around the world whose lives are in danger, and those whose lives have been lost in the war in Iran and throughout the region. And we pray for war to cease and for God's peace to reign in our world. Amen. So I'm Esther Menn, and I'm a professor here at LSTC of Hebrew Bible, and I'm chair of the ELCA Consultative Panel on Lutheran-Jewish Relations. So it's wonderful to have everyone here today, and a delight to moderate. So we want to thank Sarah Trum, the director of a Center for Christian Muslim Engagement, and Reverend Rajesh Jairaj, who's the student assistant at CCME, and Ms. Samantha Adindu. Thank you for your work in organizing this, as well as to Reverend Bose and others who are helping us with the technical aspects. We couldn't be here without you. So this season, the first and second Seders of the Passover observance are going to be during Holy Week, on Wednesday of Holy Week and Maundy Thursday. So as we enter the 3 days of Jesus' Passion and Resurrection, it's time for us to think about how we can preach the gospel with sensitivity to the observance of Passover that's going on at the same time in the Jewish community. And this topic has a special urgency now in this cultural context of heightened tensions and antisemitism. We want to make sure that we are speaking the truth and that our preaching is in the context of God's wide love and commitment to faithfulness, to guidance, liberation in both Jewish and Christian communities, from biblical times to today. So I'll introduce our panelists now, and then they'll be able to go one after the next. We have two presenters, Dr. Ruth Langer and Dr. Peter Pettit. And Dr. Langer is a rabbi, and she's the professor of Jewish studies in the theology department at Boston College, and she's the associate director of its Center for Christian Jewish Learning. She works with the development of Jewish liturgy and ritual from antiquity to the present, and also with Jewish-Christian relations. And the Reverend Dr. Peter Pettit, he's a member of the ELCA Consultative Panel on Lutheran-Jewish Relations, and he's the director emeritus of the Institute for Jewish-Christian Understanding at Muhlenberg College. He's recently retired as teaching pastor at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Davenport, Iowa. Now, after these opening presentations, we'll have two responses from Rabbi Shoshana Conover, who is the senior rabbi of Temple Sholem in Chicago, and she's also the senior rabbinic fellow of the Shalom Hartman Institute and serves on the steering committee of the Chicago Status of Women and Girls Working Group. And then we'll hear from Bishop Tom Hennon, who has served as Bishop of Baker, Oregon since 2025, so a rather recent appointment. And recently he served as Vicar General of the Diocese of Davenport and Rector of Sacred Heart Cathedral in Davenport. So we're just so happy to have you all here. And after we have our presentations and responses, then we'll have time for a Q&A with among the panelists and with those attending today. So let's get started, and we'll start with you, Dr. Langer. We look forward to hearing from you about what you have prepared.
Great. Can everybody see my screen, and is it showing up reasonably?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So today is actually Shushan Purim, the 15th of the month of Adar, the day that Purim is celebrated in ancient walled cities like Jerusalem. Purim celebrates the events of the book of Esther, particularly the survival of the Jews of Persia in spite of the evil and spiteful decree of Haman to annihilate them. This celebration, which was yesterday for most Jews, is usually one of the most fun days of the Jewish year, with feasting, merrymaking, and yes, reading the book of Esther, dressing up in costumes. I have to change the slide. So here's a picture of a family in synagogue in costumes reading the book of Esther from a scroll. And then also giving charitable gifts to the poor and sharing gifts of food with our neighbors. Now, this was all very challenged this year, both yesterday and today, because people had to stay close to their safe rooms and bomb shelters. But Purim, more to the point of our program, Purim serves another unofficial function, which is that it's always a lunar month before Passover. In traditional Jewish homes, it marks the beginning of the Passover preparations. Although there are spiritual elements to this preparation, it's primarily very concrete, deep spring cleaning to remove all traces of leavened foods before we turn to preparing new food for the festival itself. Anybody with children or grandchildren knows that it's mostly a hunt for those stray Cheerios. So why do this? Because central to Jewish practice is creating contexts which make it difficult to ignore the messages of the occasion. Passover very explicitly asks us not just to think about our place in the sweep of Jewish history, but also to identify with it, to make the memories our own. Replacing leavened bread with matzah with unleavened bread for the week of the holiday allows us, in small ways, to participate in the escape of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. God commands us to remember our going free by eating this unleavened bread. And you have some verses that command it on the screen. When Jesus and his disciples came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, there were two essential ritual foods to anticipate. One was the unleavened bread, in Hebrew matzah. Although the term Feast of the Unleavened Bread is in the Gospel accounts as an alternative name for the Passover, there's actually no account of Jesus or Paul actually consuming matzah. And since there's no mention of eating a sacrificial lamb at the Last Supper, it seems unlikely that this was also actually a Passover meal. There's no indication that the bread shared at the Last Supper was matzah. As is well known, the hints at the chronology in the various gospel accounts make reconstruction of Jesus's passion with the Jewish calendar very difficult. What can we reconstruct of a Passover celebration in the time of Jesus? There's actually very little to go on. Fundamentally, at least as the earliest rabbinic texts remember it, Jews who were able to come on pilgrimage to Jerusalem did so. Jerusalem, we know from archaeology, was full of facilities to house such guests. They had to procure a lamb worthy of being sacrificed. It meant that the lamb could not be blemished, and hence they could not risk its having journeyed with them. The money changers at the temple were necessary to facilitate the conversion of currency so that this lamb could be purchased in Jerusalem. These pilgrims would expand their family groups as necessary, so that once this lamb was purchased, slaughtered in the temple, the actual sacrificial act, and roasted, it could be totally consumed at a feast on the first night of Passover, the night of the 10th and final plague. This lamb was eaten with a condiment, some sort of bitter herbs, called maror in Hebrew, much like we add mustard today to our meat. And the special unleavened bread, Passover bread, also was eaten with it. This lamb commemorated the lamb eaten in Egypt, whose blood had marked the Israelite houses. The matzah replicated the bread of the escape the next day. We think that they probably accompanied this meal with psalms of praise to God, especially Psalm 114 that explicitly celebrates the Exodus, but likely the whole complex of Psalms 113 to 118 with their repeating praise to God. We don't know more than this. A celebration was the goal of the trip to Jerusalem. According to the Gospels, it seems that celebration didn't happen, at least not for Jesus. In the year 70, the Jews lost their revolt against Rome, and the Romans destroyed the only place where the Passover sacrifice could be offered in the world. The seeds of the rabbinic Passover observance emerged in the decades following this tragedy. The rabbis seem initially to have gathered without their families to review the laws of the Passover sacrifice of the lamb. But the content of this gathering shifted quickly to a gathering to focus on a broader content, to a telling the story of the biblical Exodus itself. By the time the Mishnah was redacted shortly after the year 200, the basic shape of the Passover Seder as we know it had emerged as a way to fill the liturgical gap left by the destruction of the temple. What Jews do today at their Seder tables is much more complex, but it derives from this rabbinic ritual. What matters in our context today, here, is that Jesus and his contemporaries could not have known the Jewish Passover as it is celebrated today. Consequently, bringing these two celebrations into conversation is something like bringing together fraternal twins who were separated at birth and arranged a meeting once they have lived full lives in different worlds. There is some shared genetic heritage, but so much that is different. Does this mean that there's no point in their getting acquainted and learning from each other? Not at all. The reunion can be fruitful, even joyous, but Jews and Christians have become very different people with different concerns and different memories. Not only that, but the communities of these twins have a difficult history of negative interactions that cannot be forgotten. This is especially the case for Jews, because much of Passover is about the intergenerational transmission of the key memories of our people. At the core of the Passover observance is the obligation to bring our children into not only knowledge of Jewish history, but into identification with it. One of the most famous statements in the Mishnah and the Haggadah is that of Rabban Gamliel, not Paul's teacher, but his direct descendant in the late 1st century, in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple. Drawing on the Bible's instruction 3 times in Exodus 12 and 13, and a 4th in Deuteronomy, Rabban Gamliel teaches, in every generation, all people are obligated to consider themselves as if they themselves had come out of Egypt. Another version of this doesn't say consider, but rather they must show themselves. They must act as if they themselves had come out of Egypt. The Midrash on these verses that enters the Haggadah as the story of the 4 types of children emphasizes that only wicked children exclude themselves from this collective. And note here the boy on the extreme right who is smoking at the table, which is otherwise forbidden, sitting back from the table and otherwise seems unengaged in the Seder. But he came. Now, note that what is primarily being remembered in those 4 verses and in Rabban Gamliel's dictum is a memory of God saving Israel. Yes, it is a memory from slavery and oppression, but that's not the central theme of the evening. The central theme is that this was a saving to a full national life in their homeland, where they would be free to worship God and live according to the instruction, the Torah, that God would give them. The immediate goal of the Exodus was Mount Sinai, but the journey continued through the wilderness until all those who had known slavery had passed on, so that their descendants without this slave mentality could be free people in their own land. This is the core memory that Passover celebrates. Now, we also need to remember that those rabbis who constructed this new ritual were not themselves any longer free people in their own land. Rome had crushed their national independence, along with the symbol of that independence, the temple where the Passover could be celebrated as the Bible commands it, and with the feast that centers then on that sacrificed lamb. So the memory of Passover gains another dimension, this time a forward-looking one. From Rabban Gamliel's day on, the temple ritual could only be remembered with other symbols: a roasted bone on the table, God's salvation to the sovereign national life. I missed a slide there. God's salvation to this is the bone, or a version of it. God's salvation to the sovereign national life in the Promised Land was again something to be anticipated, associated with hopes for the messianic age of peace and prosperity envisioned by the prophets. Think of Christian visions of what will characterize the eschaton, Jesus' second coming. There's a deep convergence here with Jewish messianic expectations. But in the meantime, life was often hard. Rome became Christendom with its anti-Jewish suspicions, teachings, and persecutions. Islam also arose, generally but not always more tolerant. The vast majority of Jews endured under these circumstances, celebrating Passover each spring. This left its mark on the Seder and on the memories it encodes, tied with those hopes for future salvation. So, one of the first moves of the Seder, unique to it, is to proclaim, while holding up a broken piece of unleavened bread. The picture here doesn't show an unbroken piece, but it is somebody holding up the bread, and the text is right. And they proclaim, "This is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in Egypt." It's a statement of memory. Let anyone who desires or needs come and eat, sharing our Passover meal. We do this here today, but next year, may it be in the land of Israel. In other words, it's a memoria futuria, statement of eschatological anticipation. Also powerful is the statement in the middle of telling the story, after mention of God's promise to Abraham that after 400 years in Egypt, his descendants would go free. The liturgy at this point interjects a praise of God for keeping this promise, but then adds, "Will all raise their wine glasses as in a toast, and this promise has held true for our ancestors and for us, for it has not been just one persecutor who rose up against us. Rather, in each and every generation, they have risen up against us to destroy us, and the Holy One has saved us from their hand." Think about this. These words didn't resonate for me much for most of my sheltered life in America, in a generation that hardly knew antisemitism, in a family not touched directly by the Holocaust. But this memory became personal on October 7th, 2023, and it became more real with each and every outburst of anti-Semitic violence, and even just anti-Semitic speech in our current times. The Haggadah, the text of the Seder, is a received text, but it is also a text meant to be studied and discussed. When we didn't have small children waking up at dawn the next morning, our family Seder would last into the wee hours, often taking 5 hours or so, including the dinner. How? Because we discussed and elaborated on much of it in lots of different dimensions. But these included current realities, both inside and outside the Jewish community. People who are persecuted and suffering around the world have a place in this memory. So do the victims of the Holocaust and the brave residents of the Warsaw Ghetto who rose up against the Nazis on the first night of Passover. So too human heroism as a tool of God has a place. When we end the formal part of the Seder with "Next Year in Jerusalem this year," I will be thinking of an inclusive messianic age where no one goes hungry, where no one suffers the effects of war, where all are free to realize their potentials as human beings. This will include my people, the Jews, but also all peoples. Thank you. Esther, you're muted.
Thank you. We muted our classroom so that the sound of the lunch and other things that didn't get in the way. But yes, thank you so much for your comments. Let's go on to Peter Pettit. Please talk with us for a bit about Easter and the connections with the Passover and other topics you'd like to raise.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you particularly to Esther, Ruth, for leading us into this topic. Ruth, I particularly appreciate your focus on memory, both past and future. You remind us that we remember not only to commemorate, but also to recover a sense of who we are and who we can become. I also really appreciate your emphasis that Passover today is not what it would have been in Jesus' day, or even among the gospel writers. And you remind us that liturgy is a living thing that serves best when it shifts and develops over time to meet the changing circumstances of life. Both of these are helpful as we think about preaching and celebrating through a Passion season that this year overlaps with Passover. Indeed, Maundy Thursday in the Western churches this year falls on the night of the second Seder. And we may therefore have a distinctive opportunity to think about and lead our communities into deeper understandings of the symbols and sensibilities of these seasons. I'd like to start by thinking further about memory. After all, it's in the New Testament already that the Last Supper and in our liturgies, there's a central command to do this in remembrance of me. Already, indeed, the gospel writers were remembering as they wrote, and they all tied Jesus' passion to the Passover. John, because Jesus is crucified at the same hour as the Passover lambs are slaughtered. The image of Jesus there is clear-cut. It already has been from the beginning of John's gospel, of course, as he has shown John the Baptist introducing Jesus to the world as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Of course, the Passover lamb does not take away sin. Nor is it the case, actually, that the Passover lamb saves Israel from slavery in Egypt. In the Exodus account, if anything, one could say the lamb saves Israel by giving its blood to protect the Israelites from a destroyer sent by God. But in the gospel, the lamb imagery gets conflated, and our liturgies and our theologies have picked up on that. In the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the connection is more directly made with the final meal that Jesus eats with the disciples. Where would you have us prepare the Passover for you? The disciples asked Jesus on what is identified as the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, according to Mark. Again, the fact that the meal they eat, as you said, Ruth, does not resemble a Passover meal seems a minor quibble when the connection is drawn so explicitly. And so too with Paul, who shows no interest in connecting his account of the Last Supper with Passover in 1 Corinthians 11. And yet earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 uses the image of Christ, our Passover lamb, in exhorting the Corinthians to clean out the old leaven of malice and evil and to live with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. In all this, perhaps James Dunn has captured this picture best when he wrote that the early church had what he called a tendency to run together different metaphors and descriptions of Jesus's death, thereby blurring older distinctions. That being the case on the face of it, we can hardly ignore a connection between the Last Supper and the Passion as a whole with the Passover. But we can ask, if we are to do this in remembrance, how are we to remember? What are we to remember? Looking again at the liturgy, the tendency is to remember the suffering and the sacrifice that is connected to it. So the language and imagery around the elevation and the fraction, the breaking of the bread, this is my body given for you. There's a strong dynamic linking the broken bread to the broken body of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians, there's even a variant reading that this is my body which is broken for you, echoing, if not even perhaps based on, the 4th century canons of Hippolytus. Equally evocative, of course, is the language, this is my blood of the covenant which is poured out for many. Blood poured out in Scripture is nearly always sacrificial. And the for you points us repeatedly to the fact that it is suffering, a sacrifice that's done on our benefit, on our behalf and to our benefit. What we remember is an atoning and or a substitutionary suffering and death that frees and forgives us. And we tend to move pretty quickly from the suffering to its benefits. Teresa Sanders, in her book Tenebrae, Holy Week After the Holocaust, notes that the appointed psalm for Maundy Thursday, Psalms 116, which is part of that Hallel sequence of 113 to 118 that Ruth mentioned in connection with the Seder, that Psalms 116 includes the verse, precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of God's faithful ones. So too, the introit for Maundy Wednesday says we should glory in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, for he is our salvation, our life, and our resurrection. Through him we are saved and made free. Even before we get to the celebration of the meal, the suffering and sacrifice have been liturgically contextualized as prelude to salvation. Well, says Teresa Sanders, not so fast. In her words, this basic tendency to skip quickly from tragedy to victory, from death to resurrection, can lead to a kind of triumphalism in which the suffering of the world is swept aside as inconsequential. That observation about our easy slide toward our own benefits is something that Catherine Sonderegger also suggests should give us pause. Her question is, who is the for you of the formula? If Jesus says this is all for you, to whom is he saying it? In the liturgy, it's pronounced to the congregation. And who then ought the congregation imagine itself to be? When Paul used those words with the Corinthians, he was calling them out, castigating them, challenging them for ignoring the hungry and rushing in to enjoy their own holy meal. Thus, he said, one goes hungry and another becomes drunk, which, he says further, is not really to eat the Lord's Supper. Looking more closely at the gospel accounts, we might notice that they show Jesus with the disciples who are happy to share the meal of God's faithfulness with Jesus, but then are nowhere to be found at the cross of his suffering. Sonderegger, in fact, suggests that an appropriate countertext from the Church's Old Testament might be Lamentations 1:12. Is this nothing to you, all you who pass by? those who pass by, those for whom the suffering of the cross is negligible, neither an end toward which one works, nor, God help us, an object of spectacle or doubt, but simply an unremarkable part of a violent, dehumanizing landscape. Those who pass by are the people through whom we might best today remember the Passion. Jesus' exhortation to do this in remembrance of me might then mean to be sure we pay attention where there is suffering, not to pass by, but to step in, to remember that the one abandoned and derelict on the cross was remembered and redeemed by God. If we want to make a connection with our Jewish neighbors in the Passover from this perspective, we would do well not to think of ourselves so much like Israel that is redeemed from slavery, nor certainly that we are the Israel who believe and so are saved, rather than the Israel who betrayed. Rather, we do well to think of ourselves right alongside Israel as a people of God with a different origin story, but also called in our own way to live as witnesses to God's power and grace and promises. Having known suffering, we too move beyond simple gratitude to ask how it is that we now best live as God's people in the world. How might this shape or reshape our observance of Maundy Thursday and the Passion and our preaching throughout the season? A few suggestions. One very concrete possibility would be to use a different psalm in the Maundy Thursday liturgy. I imagine Bishop Tom will point out to me that local Catholic congregations don't typically just change up the liturgy on their own, but hey, I'm Lutheran, others among us are also other Protestants, and we do this a little more freely. So perhaps, at least for some of us, rather than extolling the death, as Psalms 116 seems to do, we might consider using Psalms 111. Praise the Lord. I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart, in the company of the upright, in the congregation. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. Full of honor and majesty is the work of God, whose righteousness endures forever. The Lord has gained renown by wonderful deeds. The Lord is gracious and merciful, providing food for those who fear the Lord, who is ever mindful of the divine covenant. The Lord has shown the people the power of divine works in giving them the heritage of the nations. The works of God's hands are faithful and just. All God's precepts are trustworthy. They are established forever and ever to be performed with faithfulness and uprightness. The Lord sent redemption to the people and has commanded the covenant forever. Holy and awesome is God's name. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have good understanding. The Lord's praise endures forever. Or perhaps a couple of stanzas from Psalms 119. You've dealt well with your servant, O Lord, according to your word. Teach me good judgment and knowledge, for I believe in your commandments. Before I was humbled, I went astray, but now I keep your word. You are good and do good. Teach me your statutes. The arrogant smear me with lies, but with my whole heart I keep your precepts. Their hearts are thick like fat, but I delight in your instruction. It's good for me that I was humbled so that I might learn your statutes. The teaching of your mouth is better to me than thousands of gold and silver pieces. Your hands have made and fashioned me. Give me understanding that I may learn your commandments. Those who fear you shall see me and rejoice because I've hoped in your word. I know, O Lord, that your judgments are right and that in faithfulness you've humbled me. Let your steadfast love become my comfort. according to your promise to your servant. Let your mercy come to me that I may live, for your instruction is my delight. Let the arrogant be put to shame, for they have subverted me with guile. As for me, I will meditate on your precepts. Let those who fear you turn to me, so that they may know your decrees. May my heart be blameless in your statutes, so that I may not be put to shame. In both of these Psalms, the mighty work of God remains clear, but the focus has shifted from either the suffering of the psalmist or the simple joy of relief, and it takes up the call to live a life of witness and faithfulness. A second thought is that we must be careful with the Passover imagery that we use in our preaching. In particular, we must guard against the kind of blurring that Dunn has described. This means that we must know how it is that Jews today celebrate Passover, as well as what the Passover may have looked like in Jesus' day if his even was a Passover meal. And then we must say about it in either era and in general, only what we know to be true. It is unfair to a living tradition of our Jewish neighbors to make of it in our portrayal something that's not true or that's only possible just because it might serve well our homiletical interests. Third, we should follow Paul and the gospel writers, making it clear that anything we can say God has done in Christ is something that God has already done for the Jewish people and done it apart from their knowing Christ. Do we see in Christ that we're made in God's image? Jews also know that from Torah. Do we know ourselves freed and called to be God's people? Jews also know that of themselves, particularly through the Exodus. Do we know ourselves graced with a lifestyle to witness God in the world faithfully? Jews also know that in the gift of the Torah from Sinai. Do we have mechanisms of confession and forgiveness to restore us when we have failed in the lifestyle of God's people? Jews also have such mechanisms in Scripture and in liturgy. Do we carry promises of a fulfillment that is God's gracious rule over all God's creation in all its diversity? Jews also carry that promise, as Ruth has made clear. A fourth suggestion, the last one I'll make. We can recognize and remember that we do tend to be those who walk by suffering without taking note, and that God calls us to be godlike in paying attention to the last and the least, to those who are considered as nothing. And then we can follow the lead of our Jewish neighbors in the Seder. There are 4 ritual cups of wine in the Seder, which amounts to a lot of joy. And yet with the second cup, when the story is told of the plagues that struck Egypt, a drop of wine is dipped out or poured out of the cup as each plague is mentioned, out of respect and empathy for the suffering of the Egyptians that was part of Israel's experience of redemption. How might we take note on Good Friday, for example, of our awareness that Good Friday all too often was, for all too much of Christian history, a day when our Christian ancestors would leave church and hunt down the local Jews to avenge Jesus' death? Knowing that history is one thing. Finding a way to acknowledge the suffering of it in our liturgies would be quite another. There are other possibilities one can imagine for making the connection between Passion and Passover more respectful and authentic and meaningful in our day. Perhaps in all this, we can be guided and encouraged in the effort by seeing the ways in which Passover itself has developed and changed over the years. Then our understanding of Maundy Thursday and the Passion can also develop and change, so that we no longer are the better Israel who choose to follow Jesus, not the new Israel with a better redemption. Rather, we can recognize in ourselves something of the same old Israel, the same old humanity whom God has created, called, protected, and stood by through disappointment and betrayal. People who need God's power to be God's people, and who hope for the fullness of God's redemption for all, and especially for those who suffer. Sometimes for us who suffer, and always someone somewhere who is suffering and who calls for our attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much for addressing us and for giving us those practical suggestions for how to be more respectful, authentic, and meaningful in our ways of remembering and interacting. It's very powerful. So you've given us a lot to think about. Why don't we turn to Rabbi Conover for remarks at this point?
Thank you. And I'll say thank you so much, Esther, for your commitment to having these conversations, for your incredible seminary students. And thank you to Ruth and Peter for such astute remarks. And Ruth, I have to tell you, I'm a little bit of a fangirl. So it's really wonderful to hear from you today. And it was truly solidified when you gave the apt metaphor, and such an astute metaphor, about this conversation being among fraternal twins who have had a life of experience, who are now coming back together as adults, having a conversation. We share a genetic, some kind of DNA, and yet that we don't necessarily always see, and really lift our differences, saying how important those are, even as we're seeing ourselves as family. So I appreciate that metaphor. And I appreciate, Peter, the way in which you've talked about, needing to stay in the suffering, linger there a little bit longer. It helps us to really build our humanity and our empathy, but don't get stuck there. That there are ways in which then that we're able to go above. So I want to talk a little bit about this notion of that this is a time of visceral memory. The memory is not something that we're just remembering. We have to, in some ways, embody it, reenact it in these days, as well as then feel the profound brokenness and suffering in the case of the Jewish people, really looking at what it was for being enslaved, and I'm going to touch on a little bit of the rabbi's experience as well, that Ruth alluded to, and in the Christian faith, the suffering of Jesus. And then the way in which, in each case, either redemption or resurrection is then really what is the call, what is the purpose. And in the case of the Jews, the redemption that alludes to future redemption, the redemption from Egypt, then alludes for us the ultimate redemption, messianic redemption. And in the case of Christianity, resurrection. I want to talk a little bit more about repair, and the pieces in the Passover Haggadah that might then be helpful in this season, for all of you to be thinking of as other things to draw upon when we're being authentic to the Passover story, and wanting to see it in its messaging. So I'll just share that that when we hear that in the Haggadah, when we have the Seder, there's a piece that's called called Magid. That's our storytelling section. And it starts with Halach Ma'anya. It starts with that where we point to the matzah, and we've already broken this matzah, and we're pointing to it and saying that this is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. And then we say, let all who are hungry come and eat, and let all who are in need join our Passover. So that is from the outset. We have our opening statement for the rest of the storytelling that we're going to hear. And so then the next thing that happens is that we ask these 4 questions that already it is then put in. This is not something to be lectured to. If you're going to try to truly understand something, you've got to couch immediately your questions. That is the tradition, is to ask a lot of questions. And that is a huge piece of our Passover Seder that kept Ruth and her husband up all night before they were woken up by other needs that they were called upon. And we're going to talk about that with the rabbis, because what we do after those 4 questions is that we start to talk about Avadim Chayinu. We were slaves in Egypt, and we talk about the ways in which God redeemed us. And then you would think what we would do would be then to tell the story of what it was to be in Egypt and what it was to be redeemed from Egypt. But that is not what comes next in the Haggadah, in the booklet that we have to really help us arrange our Passover Seder that stays the same every year, except for the new questions that we bring and the new experiences that we take. And that the next thing that happens after we hear that we were slaves in Egypt is that we hear about these rabbis who, like Ruth and her husband, were staying up all night telling the story of the Seder, that they were having the Seder. And I'm just going to read this part in the English. Once Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon. By the way, when we go around and read this in the Passover Seder, nobody wants to have to read this passage, because getting all those names right is no easy feat, even for Jews. But it's Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, or Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon. They reclined for the Seder in Bnei Brak. And they told the Exodus from Egypt all that night until their students came in and said, "Teachers, it's time for saying the Shema of the morning. The time has come, and what are you guys doing here? You got to lead us in the opening prayers for the morning." And the thing that is happening here is significant. Why is it, instead of just going into what has happened in the past that we're remembering in the Seder, why is it that we hear about their experience? It's important. All of these people are meeting, and as Ruth already alluded, they're meeting in the time of the Romans. The temple has been destroyed. Some of them actually witnessed this destruction, and other of them are living in the wake of it. No matter what, they're all trying to find a way in which to have their lives move on after such a great, not only trauma, but also their central way of living being completely destroyed. So each of these rabbis then led the people after the Roman siege of Jerusalem. Some even witnessed the destruction of the Second Temple, an event that forever changed their lives and the future of the Jewish faith. And their stories and lives overlap and intersect, even if their viewpoints in most cases fail to align completely. The first 2 rabbis listed, Eliezer and Yehoshua, or Joshua, smuggled the great sage and Jewish leader Yochanan ben Zakkai from Jerusalem when Jewish life literally went up in smoke. And their mission was to adapt the faith to a new way of life with study at its center. So together, under Ben Zakkai's leadership, they relocated the Jewish community at that time to a new center called Yavne, which literally means to build. And so what I want to say, as far as what we look at here, is the way in which we do stay with the suffering a little bit longer. We don't just look at the suffering from what happened in Egypt, but we look at other forms of utter trauma, other destruction of that the Jewish people endured, but we don't stay there. but we go there long enough to understand that really at the heart of this, if you want to know redemption, you have to know suffering, and you have to stay in it long enough for everyone to understand what that was, and also what that will continue to be in times and different eras of the Jewish people, again, as Ruth said. And so this is also about the reality that there are times where things are destroyed and you move forward. And how do you move forward? Well, Joshua says to ascetics, it's great, and this is another place in the Talmud tells us that there were ascetics who were saying that they could no longer eat meat, they would no longer drink wine because those were things that they did at the temple in Jerusalem, as far as the offerings and as far as libations. And so then he says, well, you know what? Are you also not going to eat bread because there was meal offerings? Are you also not going to eat any fruit? There were first fruit offerings. Well, there were also water libations. Are you not going to drink any water? He says to them, it is an impulse when you have witnessed and when you have gone through utter destruction that what you want to do is say no more. We can no longer have joy. And what Rabbi Joshua teaches is actually joy can only live along with suffering. And in suffering, there is still great joy. Find it. And so what he says is, whenever you build something, make it a little less complete. Don't make it complete. Whenever you make something, leave a little bit behind. Make sure that you're always acknowledging the loss, but don't let it overtake you. And the Passover Seder is a way in which we actually focus on the joy because we've known in each age the suffering. And so that also then leads us to this last piece. Our Magid, our storytelling section, starts with looking at this broken piece. This is the bread of affliction. And we break it just before then, and half of it is hidden by adults. And then at a certain point in the Seder, all the children go and they look to try to find that other hidden piece, that other piece, that half of that lachma anya, of the bread of affliction, and they have to look to find it. What's the message that we're giving to these children? Where Joshua is saying to adults, yeah, you know what? This world is so hard. Sometimes you just want to give up. Don't give up. But what we say to our children is, look and try to find ways to find repair, because this Seder is not complete until those children find that what's called the afikomen, the other half of that broken piece of matzah, and it has to come together before we can end our Seder. So we teach our children in a world where it feels like suffering, everywhere you look, you might see it. There's another message. You, you are the people who can help us to find the hope to rebuild. You can help us find the wholeness, and we believe in you, and we believe in the ways that you will do this. Now, you seminary students, you have these wonderful messages right at your fingertips. And I love what Peter has shared as far as take these, don't conflate them. Instead, take them as these other gifts of recognizing that the Jewish tradition it was not something where there was only law that had to be replaced by love. In the law is love. In these traditions, there's a lot of love there. And so when we recognize that, we can go hand in hand as being able to find ways in which we together can see the suffering in the world. And by the way, acknowledge our own suffering. And in that way, then find ways to message not only to the children, but to ourselves as well. We can find ways to repair.
Thank you so much. So rich. Each presentation has been really, really full with so many insights and gifts. So thank you so much for giving us those concrete examples too from the Magid. Bishop Hannon, would you like to close this round out with some words?
Absolutely. And again, thank you for convening this, for inviting me, Esther, and thank you, Ruth and Peter, for your wonderful and insightful presentations. I'm taking notes as I was listening to everything, and I'm learning as I go as well. And thank you, Rabbi Conover, as well. I think the first thing I would say is that as we preach both passion and Passover, or passion in the context of Passover, to first, as Christians, to do this always, 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 and this is the point of this gathering after all, is to do this always with great sensitivity and mindfulness of our own past sins against our Jewish brothers and sisters. We can't just kind of bracket that and say that didn't happen. It did. And so there may be even opportunities in our preaching to point that out in a way where we kind of beat our own breast and say, this is problematic, right? We have, to our own shame, manipulated and weaponized our own scriptures in the past against our Jewish brothers and sisters. And so remembering that always is important. And again, as we preach the passion of Christ, I think, to my mind, the only proper way for a Christian to answer the question, who killed Jesus, is to answer, I did. I did, right? If our understanding is in some sense, right, that he died for the sins of the world, mine, yours, past, present, future, then I had a hand to play in this, right? And so that takes the focus in our preaching off of kind of what they did, right? And rather what Jesus did for me, right? And I think that's important to do that. I think we even have to be careful in how we go about, frankly, proclaiming some of the gospel passages from particularly probably John's gospel. There's a way that you could read those and emphasize certain words that are not going to help, right, this cause, that really kind of make that even worse. So I think even in our proclamation of the gospel, let alone our preaching of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection, to do this in a way that is extremely sensitive to our Jewish brothers and sisters, and also acknowledging our own past faults. So again, the emphasis in our preaching should never be on what the Jews did, or even the Romans did, or what others did, but what Jesus did for us in laying down his life as both, in a sense, priest and victim in this kind of Passover. And again, the next thing I would mention is to preach in a way that doesn't draw false equivalents. I think as Christians, we really like to see the parallels, and we sometimes like to make connections where there aren't necessarily connections. And so some of the insights you've gained already from Rabbi Conover and from Ruth especially, I think, and also from Peter, tell us, okay, this wasn't exactly what Jesus would have celebrated with his disciples in that upper room. That's an important distinction. And so not forcing false equivalents. It's kind of fun to see the parallels, and we can kind of geek out about that a little bit. We can see the common DNA that we've been talking about, right? But I think too often we're like the little kid that's trying to smash in a piece of the puzzle where it doesn't actually fit. And it's okay to just set that piece off to the side and say, well, we'll deal with that later. I don't know how that fits. So let's not try to force things. Having said that, yeah, it is a little fun to play with some of the parallels, as long as, again, we're not trying to make false equivalents here. Even in what Ruth had shared about this time of preparation between Purim and Passover, in most Christian traditions, certainly in my tradition as a Catholic, we have this kind of long period of preparation that we call Lent, right? And much like Purim, this is meant to be a period of deeper purification and cleansing, interior cleansing, where we're really preparing ourselves to celebrate these high holy days that are ahead of us. And so there is a good parallel. And I think we can say, oh, isn't it interesting? They do this and we do this. We don't have to say this is this, or this is the new this. We don't have to replace. We can just say, wow, isn't it interesting that across religions and even within Christianity, we have these parallels, and I think that should be something that unites us rather than divides us by trying again to force kind of an equivalent, or kind of a theory of well, this replaces this, or this is the new this, not necessarily, right? I mean, for us as Christians, obviously, we do draw a strong connection between the Passover meal and the Last Supper and the Eucharist, I think it's interesting to point out, from our perspective, yeah, there's no mention of matzah specifically. There is unleavened that is apparently used in that. Jesus takes bread, breaks it, blesses it, gives it to his disciples, and says, "This is my body." But there's no mention of a lamb or anything like that. I think that is interesting to point out. And of course, from a Christian perspective, we see kind of the Passover happening in stages, and one of the stages is that evening in the upper room. But it's really kind of fulfilled in what Jesus does the next day from the cross. In laying down his life as this lamb as the Lamb of God. I do think that we celebrate our liturgies with an unleavened bread, and it's important to remember part of that imagery for us too is this is bread for the way. It's unleavened because we didn't have time to let it rise, and so we're on the move. We're in flight. We're on pilgrimage, right? And that is an image I think that we can maybe use a little bit more too. And even just talking about our earthly pilgrimage, we're on the move. We're in flight in some sense. We could talk about the Exodus of 40 years or a very long time. To me, it doesn't break my faith if it's not exactly 40 years, and doesn't break my faith if Jesus's fast in the desert was exactly 40 days or a very long time. But those numbers are thrown at us so that we can kind of see, okay, there's intentionally use of symbolism here on the part of Christian authors to say this is like, right, or it draws from. So that Exodus of 40 days, of 40 years, kind of reflected in Jesus's fasting in the desert for 40 days, and then our own 40 days of Lent in this time of preparation. I find, specifically in the Catholic liturgy, some really interesting parallels. We begin around a fire and a blessing of this fire. We bless an Easter candle, kind of a column of fire, and we process it through the church, and then we proclaim the Exultet. We chant the Exultet, which is the Easter proclamation. And what's very interesting in that Easter proclamation, and is found in a lot of different prayers that we use in the Catholic Church and in the Christian tradition in general, is a lot of it is written in the present tense. We say over and over again in that Exultet, this is the night, this is the night, this is the night, that this happened, that this happened, that this happened. And I think that is drawn directly from this very Jewish sense of memory which makes present again. And so that's rich in our Christian tradition for sure. So I think that's important. I think of sometimes it has happened in places where I've been a pastor before, where people will say, "Hey, Father, we want to have a person come in and do a Seder meal for us," and so that we can kind of see what that's like. Personally, I don't know what Pastor Peter has to say about that, but I urge against that for the same reason that if someone said, "Hey, Bishop, can I borrow some stuff? We want to kind of put on like a kind of Catholic mass in our Protestant church or in our synagogue, just so we have a sense of feel like that." It's like, I would much rather come and explain to you what we do, or invite you to even just come and sit in the back pew of a mass and see what it's like, rather than kind of trying to do this like simulation of something that is really not ours, right? And is sacred and should be treated as such and respectfully. So I would say, if you have people in your congregations, present or future, that are saying they want to do this, I would caution against it, or find a different way to go about doing that a little bit. I would just close with, I guess, as kind of my own little sum. I was going to try to come up with 10 commandments of preaching with sensitivity, the Passion and the Passover, but I only came up with about maybe 5 or 6 or 7 here. But the first is, again, just preaching with sensitivity to the past, especially our past sins as Christians, in relationship to the Jewish people, and like I say, the way that we've manipulated our own scriptures in some ways to blame, to scapegoat, to persecute. That has to be kind of in the fore of our mind. And I think of that line from Psalm 51: "Our sin is before us always." Like we hold it there, not to kind of cudgel ourselves with it, but so that we never go back and do that again, right? Again, preaching not what they did, but preaching what Jesus did is very important for us. Preaching with sensitivity to Jewish history and culture and avoiding that kind of appropriation, like trying to have a simulated Seder meal or something like that, avoiding those kind of false equivalency. This is exactly like this. No, it's not exactly like this. Being honest about that, I think, is important. I think we can preach the parallels, and I think we have to, and I think we should give credit where it is due. Sometimes I think as Christians, right, we think, oh, we came up with all of this stuff. No, we didn't. We borrowed a ton, right? A whole lot, right? And so to say this is actually something that is part of our shared DNA with our Jewish brothers and sisters that we emphasize in our own prayers. Preaching in a way that doesn't make others other, right? And that doesn't other people, right? But rather preaching in a way that draws us together. And again, I think that's where we talk about here's what our brothers this week, in fact, are doing in the Jewish community. And this is what we're doing. And we can see how there's some commonalities there. That's all fine. Preaching in a way that is sensitive, not just to, that is also kind of sensitive. I think, frankly, we miss this as Christians too. Preaching in a way that is sensitive to some of the things which Jesus said, which were very, very scandalous to his own listeners and even his own disciples, right? We kind of just buzz over that and we say, what's the big deal? Because we're so kind of used to it. But I think if we dig into some of those statements, we can see why this would put people on their back foot a little bit and say, what is going on here, right? So I think there is a way that we can preach even in a way that is acknowledging kind of the scandalous way that Jesus did all of this. Lastly, I would say preaching forward, and I think both Ruth and Peter talked about this. Really, the question for us in these days to come and in our preaching is not so much what happened back then, but how does what happened back then affect how I act today, right? What does this mean for me now? How do I live out of this gift? How do I live out of this saving reality of God? And what does that mean in how I treat my brothers and sisters? So we're preaching always with a mind to the future, preaching forward in a sense. So those are just some scattered thoughts a little bit on what I had on this, but hopefully helpful to you all. But again, so grateful for this conversation, so grateful to hear from my colleagues on this. I'm gaining insights for my own preaching as I prepare for Holy Week in a few weeks.
Thank you so much. It was really rich. I think we have 8 Good. Well, we have so little time. I was going to ask the members of the panel if one of you had a question or a topic that you wanted to ask of another panelist. So I'm just going to leave a second here in case something came up. And if not, then perhaps someone either in the room or on Zoom has a question for our panelists. Let's see if we have anybody. You can either chat or you can raise your hand. Well, I did have a question. If I don't see anybody raising their hand or vocalizing a question, but I'm so taken by the richness of all this, it's hard to know where to kind of jump in. But it seems to me that we're so privileged to have this reflection within the presence of each other on these most holy and sacred times, and I can see from my Lutheran perspective how important it is to hear about Passover, learn more about it, and so forth. I'm wondering from our Jewish participants here, the rabbis, what are there benefits also of like the fraternal twin meeting up with you? And yeah, I mean, we draw so much as Christians on the imagery and we tell the story, we want to be truthful and so forth. But now I'm just wondering if you can reflect, do you get anything out of this meeting over coffee after centuries to learn from us about our traditions? There's just different motivations, I think, different perspectives. I don't know if that's an interesting question, but Ruth, do you want to say something?
Well, I would say it's a challenging question.
Okay, I'm trying to
because
be challenging.
the Jewish community has this history of defensiveness and a very strong, very long memory of suffering.
Yeah.
And some of that's around Passover.
Mhm.
Passover Seder, beyond what I already mentioned, includes a medieval tradition of opening the door for Elijah. Well, why Elijah? Because Elijah is the announcer of the Messiah, and there's a belief that that is something that is tied to Passover. But what do we say when we open the door? We say verses that are really the traditional verses are they would be censored out by the church, would have been censored out by the church, except for their biblical verses. And the censors generally let biblical verses be. They pour out your wrath against the nations who do not know you. And it goes on in that vein for a couple verses in most of the versions. And so how do we deal with that? Because I know that my ancestors were saying that their Christian neighbors didn't know God and asking for God's vengeance, God's justice, really, against the persecutors of the Jews. So how do we deal with that today? And well, one way that works for me, I don't know if it works for everybody, is to emphasize that who do not know you. And if I believe that my Christian and my Muslim friends, colleagues, neighbors do know God, maybe differently than I do, but they do know God, then it's no longer against them specifically. And that opening the door in some ways is a gesture of welcome. In fact, there are Jews, I believe the Sephardi communities, Jews of Spanish and Portuguese origin, would keep the door open during the entirety of the Seder for exactly that reason. In Northern Europe, that wasn't such a good idea this time of year. I don't know about where all you are, but we still have snow on the ground here in Boston.
Very cold here too.
So you don't want to keep the door open for the several hours of the evening meal as a mark of safety. It also just wasn't that safe. So there's a very strong heritage situation that shaped what Jews do at Passover. And when Shoshana, you may be in a somewhat different situation because the Reform movement feels much freer to change and readjust the liturgy than the world that I'm living in these days. But it is what comes in in different ways is coming in incidentally. So it'll be the reading that my daughter, who's also a rabbi, will bring to the table about the crisis of the year. So about the immigrants or some such thing. I don't know what she's planning this year.
Thank
I
you for
appreciated that you brought up that defensive stance, because even that opening of the door, today we would think about, and we would go back to thinking about opening a door the way in which, Abraham and Sarah were the model for welcoming others in, and being able to say, like, we're going to keep our homes open on all sides in order to welcome in the stranger, and that is such a huge piece of Judaism, except for lived experience, except for when it became unsafe to do that, except for when you could only, open your door for a moment, hoping that Elijah would come and hoping that other strangers wouldn't come in and do something that was horrible. And so there is that reality. And so what is wonderful for me about this day is hearing other things than the way in which passion plays had been manipulated as ways of being places of hate, but you are showing the ways in which they can be places of love, and that they are primarily for that, and that hate that has come in has been a manipulation, not its essence. And hearing from both you, Bishop, and you, Peter, that's very helpful to hear, and to be able to really know you is also something that's so helpful. It then creates this instead of feeling like we need a defensive stance, it makes it feel like, oh, we're not alone. And that is a profound comfort right now. And that also then allows us to say, and you know what, we're both looking at things right now that we can do something about together. When you say, Peter, you know, when they say, like, who are you walking by? What should you be noticing? We're all noticing it. So then how are we coming together in ways that are true to ourselves? And by knowing you better, I know then how to be respectful for what you need. And now that you know me and you know Ruth and you know Judaism better, you also know then how to make sure to respect what we need so that we can work together authentically as ourselves.
Thank you so much for those really deep answers. We want to be continuing to walk alongside you, and we also want to continue our study with additional resources. So Sarah Trump's going to talk a little bit about some resources that we do have for your consideration.
Not what I wanted. There we go. Whoops, there we go. Hi, everyone. I have a few resources that we found to be really helpful, and especially some things that Peter Pettit brought to us. So if you wanted to get those resources, not only are they here on the slide, but I will send along with the recording of this this event, this conversation to you all after maybe later in the week, as soon as I get the link to that. So just wanted to make sure that you have those. This preaching and teaching with love and respect for the Jewish people is something that was worked on very hard by people like Peter Pettit and Esther Menn. and so I hope that you find that helpful.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you for following up with everyone with the recording and with these resources. And so now we'll say goodbye, friends. And thank you so much for this rich conversation. I feel that I learned a lot, and I think it's very important for us to continue these kinds of dialogues. So thank you, and have a good rest of the day and this whole month.
Thank you. Yes.
So long.